Welcome to the Forward Unto Dawn podcast, the show about the story and universe of the Halo franchise. This is episode number 37. I'm David, and I'm joined by co-host Dani.
Hi, Leo.
And our guest today is Penn's Halo.
Hey, thanks for having me.
This episode, we're going to talk about the latest Halo novel, which is Troy Denning's Shadows of Reach, released October 2020. So, Denning, in case you haven't noticed, this is, as we were talking about in the pre-show, like the 32nd Halo novel, and there's a lot of Halo novels now, and this is Denning's 5th contribution, I believe, 5th or 6th, and so since last year's Oblivion, he's basically the most prolific Halo author at this point, and I think a key element of that in this book and his others is like this Denningverse with characters that are popping up in all of them. So if you're a fan of Denning's work, you see a lot of the same people popping up, and there's sort of an overall arc being built throughout all his stuff now. Before we get into like the spoilery blow by blow for this, Pens, what were your overall thoughts on the book?
I thought it was well, I really enjoy Denning. I like his take on the characters. I love how he writes Blue Team and their interactions. He does give that feel of them being a family. And I liked how it actually had a lot of tie-ins to the Fall of Reach. There were enough small callbacks there that it made me just appreciate it and the effort that it took to actually put those in. One in particular really resonated with me. We can talk about that one later, but I really enjoyed it. There were some surprises in there, definitely, with some of the characters we saw, and I don't know if I'd call it a MacGuffin, but well, we can kind of save it, I guess. But just the way the storylines you thought were all going in one direction, and all of a sudden they split.
Yeah, no, I think we're going to get into it, but I definitely think I think this is like his 5th Halo book.
Yeah,
and he's definitely got certain Denningverse tropes at this point, and I think the MacGuffin is definitely one of them, and which we'll talk about the inciting incidents for this entire book. But it's interesting you mentioned that you think of it as a sequel to The Fall of Reach. I think of it more as a sequel to The First Strike, but I think this is definitely a book. There are books that are sort of sequels to themselves. There are books that are standalone, and then there are the Halo novels that feel like they're sort of tying a bunch of threads together. Like I would consider Silentium that kind of book, because it ended the Forerunner trilogy, but it also tied a whole lot into. At the time, I was like, if the Halo universe ended with this book, I'd be happy, because it tied up a whole bunch of stuff and like bridged a lot of things. And I'd say a similar book was Halo Renegades, because it tied up a lot of loose ends that we've had since Primordium, stuff like that, different franchises, and sort of brought them up to date. And we sort of get a similar thing here, where Denning, he's tying up plot threads from his own books, but there's stuff from First Strike, as you say. There's stuff from Fall of Reach, and it all. It's nice because these books don't exist in their own vacuum, and when they touch on things from other authors, it makes it feel a lot more rich thematically, I think.
Yeah, and I guess the reason I look at Fall of Reach is my favorite Halo novel. Period. End of story. First Strike is really great too. It's just that First Strike and Fall of Reach I've always thought they could have been one novel, just kind of they were just split into two. So I see what you mean by it being kind of more of a sequel to First Strike. But I can, like I said, those two are, to me, seem so intertwined, those first two by an island, that Shadows of Reach kind of ties to both of them, at least in my mind.
Well, I think you're definitely right. I think thematically, it's definitely tying more to, because this is Blue Team going back to Reach, and John's feelings about it, and that definitely ties more into the Fall of Reach. But yeah, as you say, they could be one book, because Reach barely falls in the Fall of Reach. You get mostly of that stuff is all in the beginning of First Strike. So it is kind of, they are very much two books that go together really well, and that follows up on both of them. All right, so want to dig into it then?
Sure, yeah.
Spoilers ahoy. All right, so this whole thing starts October 2559, 1 year after Halo 5, which they helpfully tell us right up. And so we've got Blue Team. They're back on Reach for a special mission and a stealth pelican, an owl. So that's new. And they set everything out pretty quickly that they're on a mission to find the ruins of Castle Base, which was pretty much leveled by the Covenant in First Strike. And they're going to get some special stuff Halsey left behind. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but do they actually ever explicitly say what they're getting in this book?
No, I don't think they actually ever do. At no point do they actually explicitly say, "Oh, well, they're going to get X," and even at the end, they don't really say. They kind of hint about it, although I think that hint is more for the people who are more deeply into the lore of it. But the fact that it's kind of left as a mystery to most readers, I think, is actually kind of interesting. But they never really do.
Yeah, and it's weird because, like you say, for deep lore people, you absolutely know pretty much, I think, from the get-go, at least the hardcore fans definitely know what this is almost immediately. And like we were saying, tying into old threads, this is tying into Halsey's journal, the bit that came with the limited edition of Reach. And I will strut my peacock feathers and point out that I totally called this. We have a piece written in 2017 called Hope for Halsey, where I talk about what do you do with a character like Halsey who can't be redeemed in the usual way because she kind of already saved the universe. And one of the things I pointed out is she's got these forgotten extra clones from the batch that made Cortana. They're just lying around. What are you going to do with those? And that seems 99% certain what Blue Team went to recover, because they talk about getting some cryo bins. So it's probably the flash-coned remains of Halsey's weird sister-daughter things that were used to make Cortana.
Yeah, she made 12 of those, if I remember right.
I don't remember
I think that's what they were, but the number's kind of irrelevant. But there's definitely more than one left.
I want to say that there were 7 that were viable at the end, but who knows? I could be confusing my Halos with Halsey clones at this point. But either way,
yeah.
And that seems to be the obvious thing. But it's interesting that, like you say, they don't make that apparent to people who are just casual. We just know it's going to be a thing that's important. So I'm not sure. It'll be interesting. I guess we'll talk about where stuff goes from here at the end. But it's interesting that they maybe they're saving that for something else. But it was a nice deep lore cut, because I'm personally of the opinion that the Halsey's journal is the best part of Halo Reach. So I'm happy to see more stuff getting pulled from that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you. I would actually argue that Halsey's journal is probably the best piece of Halo lore out there.
Which is why shout out to Duststorm on Podtacular. They've got the peanut gallery always asking when he's going to do that.
Yes, and I'm the one who actually leads that question.
Yeah. And on that note, I think this book is really interesting in that it treats Reach as a character more than Halo Reach the game did. There's a whole lot more geography and time spent talking about parts of Reach, whereas before you had Nyland's locations in the Fall of Reach and First Strike, and then you had the stuff in Halo Reach, and they didn't really connect, and the geography was not super clear, and it mostly all took place on this one continent part, and we didn't know everything. But this actually spends a lot of time. I think it's kind of pointless if you don't particularly care about that, but if you do, this gives you a huge amount of geographical information about Reach we just didn't get before. I guess was sitting in some lore book somewhere, just dump of facts of Reach, and Denning just went and ran with that, which is I appreciate.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think I hadn't quite thought of it in that way as you put it, that it was an actual character, but it makes sense because the Spartan twos never really had a quote. They don't remember home, not really. But so Reach always was their home, um, and one early on as Chief is prepping in that first chapter where you hear he's reminiscing about Reach, and on top of everything that happened prior in Halo 4 and 5, but you could tell it means something to him. And in some ways, it's nice to see that development of him where, I mean, the end of Halo 4 when he's standing alone on the observation deck of Infinity, and he says, "She said that to me once about being a machine." Um, Talking about Cortana and trying to figure out which one was human, which one was the machine. It's nice to see that aspect coming out of Chief, um, and
Hmm.
and I think Denning actually writes that really well.
Yeah, and I think thematically, this is Denning really because he's covered a blue team in pieces before, and but most of the stuff he's done recently, Silent Storm and Oblivion, are early Chief, and so this is really Denning's first crack at uh, modern Chief, and he definitely puts him in a much more reflective mood, which I think makes sense because he's been in a much more reflective mood in Halo 5.
Hmm.
Like he gets, as you say, he gets a character moment early on while they're getting to the into position, where he's like, "Hey, if I had the time, he'd like to know how the colonists were doing on this planet because we learn that for like about the past 2 years, their reach has been resettled by humans in Epos, and there's conflict between them and scavengers. And at the time, Chief's like, well, too bad we won't have a chance to see how they're doing. Spoiler: he will get that chance. Um, but yeah, he's definitely throughout this book. Actually, he gets a lot more reflective times that shade him in. One thing I noticed is that um, throughout, one thing that's been pretty consistent from Nyland to Denning and on is that Chief is a okay being a child soldier. Um, he's like, well, like Halsey did kind of like kidnap me and stuff, but she made me. I couldn't have been this otherwise, and he's totally fine with that. Whereas other Spartans, we've gotten much more mixed negative reactions. He's totally a okay with it. But in this book, through a lot of characters we see, we have him really reflecting more on his legacy than I think we have before, and he gets a point where they're talking about these settlers and the potential that they're gonna basically have to have their kids fight, and he's a okay being a child soldier. He is not a okay with having other kids be child soldiers,
Right.
which was an interesting bit, and we definitely get a similar amount of reflection in a different way. That's very different, befittingly, of the character that we'll talk about later with Halsey. But yeah, this I would say this book like it makes Reach a character, and it also treats the fallen Reach as a character. And I was thinking while we are doing this, like, man, we should be like kind of giving out like awards to each book as we go of just like things and like this. If there was the As the Humans Say award for like term or like concept or line most hammered to the point of excessiveness in a book, for this one, it's let me try to do it. Lechatearly is my best
Oh yeah.
attempt at the lechatearly. Let's say it a couple times, but that's the uh, molten glassy silicate material that's left, basically covering everything after the Covenant glass to Reach. And man, that word gets used a lot. It's precise, but it gets used a lot.
Yeah, it does. And I'll admit I stumbled over that one a few times before I try to figure it out. Your pronunciation is better than what I came up with. So,
Oh yes, I'm very, very utterly finished and bored listening and reading to descriptions of boring, generic, glassy areas ever since Glasslands, and this book gave me horrible, horrible flashbacks to barren wastelands full of smoke and misery.
Yeah, well, along with that, there's a lot of Hungarian in this because it's Reach, and they established that Reach has a bunch of Hungarian descended settlers. So I was reaching for the pronunciation for a lot of these things, and I'm gonna try my best because that's the downside of not doing these via audiobooks. Like we got through the entire thing of Halo Renegades with me saying Rion instead of Ryan because I hadn't heard it. I'm like, oh, of course it's short for Orion. How did I do that? That's the downside of not using the audiobooks. But so you're gonna hear some questionable things. I'm sorry, listeners, but I tried my best. So yeah, that word gets used a little too much. But I think overall the description of the Glasslands, basically, I think aside from the Return, a short story in Halo Evolutions, and some stuff from Karen and Travis's Kilo 5 trilogy, we don't get a lot of ideas of what it's like being on a glassed planet. And this makes it really interesting because it's not, you just think, oh, well, everything's burnt to cinder and there's like glass on top. And this is one of the first times where I think Denning put a lot of effort into like understanding geology. And that's why there's Lecheteria in this, but it generally pays off because it gives a much more interesting thing that actually ties into the plot of like how it basically cooled, this molten surface cooled from the top down. So there's like these weird hazards where there's glass, but everything underneath it is hollow. It's still misty and cloudy from all the atmosphere of like the oceans that boiled up, and now it's still in the atmosphere. It's really cool, and I like it. And even though we don't like exactly go back to some locations, we do in certain instances. I like it. I think it's a much better attempt at the same thing that Hunters in the Dark did, where we returned to the Ark, but unfortunately, like, it generally didn't feel like we were on the same place because we didn't have the land posts. But Denning does a really great job of that, I think, here.
Yeah, it does.
So, of course, things don't go to plan. And so they quickly find out on their way to the drop site that they have Seraphs approaching and they're brutes. Oh no. And we get a bit here that sets up the post-created world, which is useful, especially since we're having such a time jump from Halo 5 to Infinite. And they give us a lot, I think, teased throughout the book, which is really great. That basically, like, the solution to Cortana right now is you run like hell, and that everyone's kind of trying to do this, like, let's just keep things quiet and like low grade warfare so that way she doesn't notice.
Yeah.
Which is a fun thing. And they give the line, it's the Pax Cortana. There's also a Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows mechanic where everyone's like, maybe don't say Cortana in case she's listening, which is, it's funny, but also it ties in, I think, really well with the stuff they established in Hunt the Truth, where, yeah, people are paranoid because, I mean, the UNSC had people listening everywhere. And we also get, Denning's really the first person to do stuff with the Spartans' onboard computers.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think was kind of weird in Silent Storm just because we didn't have that stuff before. But it's interesting here that he mentions, like, yeah, it's not as good because now we're using dumb AIs rather than the smart ones, which unfortunately leads to the question that is not answered in this book: what the hell happened to Roland?
Yeah, that's true. It's like, as I was reading through it, I'm like, something doesn't seem right here.
I'm like,
I
no,
mean,
Roland.
Yeah, I hope nothing happened to him. I can't remember. I mean, I don't know if he would be near his expiration date. I don't think so, but
no, because he's as established. I don't know if it was particularly established originally, but he's basically pre-Spartan Ops, post Halo 4. So he's middle age at best.
Yeah.
He's not anywhere close to retirement. And I hope they don't just lose him. And like, I know people were freaking out when they saw the Walmart exclusive short story being called Sacrifice. Like, don't you kill Roland?
No.
But at this point, it's just unclear what's happening. And I hope that we do get something of him in Infinite or something else, because they did a good job between Frank O'Connor's Saint's Testimony and Halo 5
Oh
with
yeah.
Roland being one of the few AIs who didn't defect. Like, I like Roland. He's fun. He's got a character, and I think he has something useful to say in where they're going with the plot.
Oh yeah, definitely. Roland definitely is is great. He reminds me a little bit of Serena from Halo Wars, just not as sarcastic. But
yeah, he's sort of like on the spectrum of Cortana's to Serena. He's maybe somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, something in that.
He's not as sardonic, but he's still a little witty.
Oh yeah, but let's just hope that they don't kill him off screen.
Yes, that's always the concern, or like in the first 2 seconds of.
Just don't Jewel Dama him, please.
Yeah, give him a mission. Give him 2 missions, please.
Yeah.
And so Chief is recalling the last time an insertion went to plan, which we get apparently was 2550. And here's a little Denningverse touch, is that when they went to capture Hector Nieto, who came up, he was the bad boy in Silent Storm. And Last Light was mentioned. He was hiding out on Gao. And like we were saying, this is an older Chief. He gets, throughout this, he's getting a little crotchety. He gets a little paternalistic with the youngins.
Especially Chop Off.
I wouldn't say it feels, I wouldn't say it's necessarily feels out of character. It's just definitely a different shade of character that we haven't seen with him as much. And we get some action stuff. And so it's, we've got Blue Team. And then we've got Chapoff, who's the young hotshot pilot.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Ben Hoot, who's the grizzled old veteran. And then what's her name?
The crew chief.
Yeah, where's that? God.
Makai. I think that's what.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
We'll fix it later. Yeah, and so it's the action stuff I wrote in my notes several times. Action stuff happens. It's not what I'm interested in. I know that's where I'm weird. And I think if you're going for the technical action sequence stuff, that is where Nyland still is king.
Oh yeah.
But I think Denning, they're serviceable. I know you can't make a Halo book without him, and he does, we'll get to him later, but he does some nice inversions of what you usually get. I think the interesting thing here is, of course, they're forced to crash land. Surprisingly, they don't kill the grizzled old veteran who does the, I'm stand by, Chief, I'm going to pull this thing, I don't have time to explain. But they actually get him out when they crash, which I was like, oh, that's not what I expected to happen. And so they have to like fight off some brutes, and we get our infinite tie-ins. So you know that this is like setting things up. So we got the MA40 assault rifle, although at one point someone's mentioned of having a classic MA5B, which I'm like,
I think that was the crew chief. No,
yeah,
that was the Pelican crew. They had that because it's shorter.
Yes, it's got the bullpup, and later on there's MA37s from Reach. We get Brute Marauders, which is a new type of vehicle, which I think is probably going to show up in Infinite because they spent a lot of time on them. There's Grievers, they're bombers that come up later. I don't know if those will show up in Infinite. There's Manglers, they're a new weapon, probably going to show up in Infinite. Other stuff returns, like the M45E is from Halo 5, maybe even Halo 4. And the grapple shot is the big thing at several times. We get to see grapple shotting. So that's how you know this is tying into Halo Infinite. We got these things. And I like that they shade the brutes. We're going to find out pretty quickly that it's banished. But they have a little bit where Chief's like, well, the keepers of the One Freedom, which are the Denning brutes, basically, are more organized. The Banished are more competitive, as we're going to find out.
That was actually one of the big surprises that threw me a bit. I mean, you knew that they were going to have. It was probably going to be some brute, but considering we are talking the Denningverse, you always thought they were going to be keepers. That the fact that the keepers joined up with the Banished, or at least the sect that was left in the Orion arm. That was actually a pretty big surprise because the way, you know, the Keepers were very much old Covenant religion,
Mm-hmm.
and the Banished are not. And it's
Yeah.
just interesting. It's more along the lines of like a necessity
Mm-hmm.
for them to be able to.
Yeah, they're allies of convenience,
Yes,
as it turns
yeah.
out. And I wish there was more Banished Keeper stuff in here. But like I was saying earlier, this is like a tie-up book. It actually kind of wraps up some of those threads from Denning's stuff, which it's a nice touch. The only other notes I had for this section, besides like Fred uses the drills they brought as AA guns and they freak him out, which is fun. They extract everyone from the crash. Apparently, I don't remember if they've mentioned before, but that the Seraphs have self-mending hulls, which I don't know if it was a new detail, but it was definitely something that caught my eye. They mentioned like the self-healing hull is trying to fix the fact that it's been busted beyond repair, which is interesting.
Nanites.
Yeah, nanites. Actually, and they mentioned later on for the Gen 3 armor that they have self-repairing armor for them too. So nanites, man. Nanites.
Well, to be fair, the nanites were first, at least officially introduced, if I remember correctly, in Mortal Dictata, I think.
It might have even been as early as Glasslands.
Yeah,
where they had Mark
was.
7.
Yeah.
Which they haven't, I don't think, given us the lore tidbit about why Mark 7 went away. But nanites, they came up there. But yeah, as like we said, this is the return of Castor, the leader of the true believer of the Keepers of the One Freedom. And so here he's leading his friends with the Banished, basically. And I like that he gets, I think one of the great things Denning does, and this feels like Oblivion in certain ways, because also in Oblivion you had smart Covenant and smart humans, but they spend a lot of the time, not as much as in Oblivion, just totally being in the dark about each other's motives. And I like that. Like he pretty quickly, like Sherlock Holmes, deduces the fact that, all right, this is some spec ops team of humans. What are they after? And he makes the assumption, well, they're after what we're after. And the humans make the assumption, well, the Banished are after what we're after. And eventually it comes out that that's not true at all. But it's nice to have them kind of like figuring things out. And it's nice where it never, I think, if in the hands of a worse writer, it would be frustrating, because usually it's frustrating when the characters don't know what we know and it makes them look like idiots. But I think that Denning does a really good job of making it believable and making it part of the suspense instead of an annoyance.
Yeah, I think just the way that the presentation of the interaction, and then also the fact that there was a former Sangheili Blade Master kind of attached to the Keepers is kind of a watchdog, I guess is the only way I would kind of describe it.
Yeah, and that
was interesting too.
Yeah,
so
and that's
that interaction was really, really interesting from a politics standpoint.
Yeah, I think that was one of my favorite character pairings. So we got Castor, we get a couple other people, maybe not important for this book or later on, but they make their presence here. There's Orson, who was he died in Retribution, but he was Castor's buddy. His kids there. He's the young hotshot brute. There's a lot of young hotshots in this one. Krellis. And then there's the Blade Master, like you mentioned, who is a former Silent Shadow guy. So Denningverse. And he's just sort of overseer of Castor. He's Ishlan Gagudai or something like that.
Yeah, Gadugai. Yeah, I think it's probably the best way to describe it.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's employed by Asharum, who Halo Infinite, possible big bad, and we'll get into this, I guess, later at the end of the book. We'll talk about what this means for Infinite. But yeah, so the Keepers are a wary ally of the Banished, and basically at this it starts, there's sort of low-key fighting between them. So there's two other brutes, the Ducelium and Ballas Pax, but those are their leaders. We get a time frame that basically 6 months ago is when they joined up. And like you said, there's an interesting interaction because the keepers are true believers. Well, and so they're like, well, working with these heretics, whatever. And the interesting thing for them in the post Cortana world is they call Cortana the apparition, and basically just see her as like this blasphemer.
Yeah, blasphemer, usurper. Yeah.
And especially to them, she's sort of the boogeyman. Yeah. So it's a nice part. And so we know
another Harry Potter Voldemort reference kind of a thing. Everyone's afraid of saying it.
Yeah. But I mean, they're ex-Covenant basically, so of course they're going to be more poetic. That's part of their thing. And so Asharam, he was basically put in charge of the Banished while Atriox pieced out on his special mission, which we know from Halo Wars 2 is the Ark. And I like that this sort of dichotomy of the brutes. They're fighting external threats, but they're also fighting each other. And I like that, especially because that ties into, if you believe it, we've caught up to the return from Halo Evolutions, which took place in 2559 at the same time. And they mention, the Elite mentions that the brutes are basically all fighting amongst each other still, and they've regressed. Didn't mention the Banished, but obviously he couldn't because the Banished hadn't been invented yet. But it's a nice little touch in. And while the humans are after the MacGuffin that is never mentioned but is totally cloned Halsey brains, the Banished are on reach for a Foreigner slip space portal because Atriox made contact months ago. So the time frame works out that this is basically March to June 2559 was the events of Halo Wars and the DLC. So obviously, after the events of Waking the Nightmare, he's still alive, still fighting. And Atriox says that they found the Forerunner crystals from Halo First Strike, which, if we also found out from Renegades, were pieces of the Forerunner crystals that were used for slip space. So they're like slip space flakes, basically, from chipped off of a mother crystal. And so Atriox found these. Apparently, they were still on Truth's key ship the entire time. And we get details later on. We'll talk about the bonus story tying into that. And we also get what I feel is sort of like the soft massaging / retcon of the Great Journey, in that Castor mentions at one point the Psalm of the Journey, where the infidels are consigned to oblivion when the Great Journey happens, and it's treated much more as like, well, we all die, but the worthy are propelled to salvation. So it makes it, I guess, a little, because there's always been that concern with people like, well, the Halo 3 truth doesn't make any sense. What's he talking about? Like, he must know the rings are going to blow up everybody. And I think this sort of helps make more sense, why the Covenant would still try and light the rings, etc., etc.
Yeah. Although you have to remember, Truth actually held a lot of that stuff very close to his chest. So I always took the Keepers as they were the faithful, but they didn't have full knowledge,
political knowledge. Yeah. And it's still up in the air exactly, because we found out from Awakening the Nightmare, for instance, that there's like rumors of like, well, there was the flood was on the Ark or stuff, but it seems actually that the Covenant overall, the ex-client Covenant species, know less about what happened than even the UNSC in some respects. So it's interesting what knowledge of the war is out there. And obviously the Keepers of the One Freedom don't care, because they're true believers. Yeah, so they're working with the other packs, which are called the Legion of Corpse Moon and Ravaged Tusks. So the Banished are metal as hell. Mm-hmm. They're shredding on their guitars with like, I just pictured the text in like crazy, barely readable, angular, crazy overwrought font like they're a black metal band.
Yeah, logos like the old '80s metal bands.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And Castor continues to be the best brute because he treats his grunts like normal people, like well, and he's like, wow, surprised they're so much better in combat because I don't treat them like crap.
you mean he
Something the
doesn't punt them and
Banished,
use them as bombs?
yeah, the Banished could learn something, but probably not going to.
No.
Yeah, and like this entire thing is setting up like the everybody's smart but wrong Denning trope. And so Castor's wrong about blue team's intentions, thinks they're there to stop them, and that sort of sets up this evolving combat. And unfortunately, we don't get a lot from Castor in this entire book. He just pops up periodically, but it sets up the conflict and the misunderstanding.
Well, I think we get more of, like I said, just the general politics, for maybe lack of a better term, of the Banished, and that really it is Atriox that holds them together. Because I honestly, knowing what we know about Atriox, I can't see the Legion and Ravaged Tusks fighting like that if he was actually present.
Yeah, and that'll come up later, but it's definitely a something they mention.
And just one other thing about this part, at least the previous part where we were talking about Blue Team, what I also liked was you got a little bit more personality from Linda, Fred, and Kelly.
Yeah,
so that was also really cool.
Yeah, we'll talk a little more about that. And you're right. I definitely think they make Atriox out to be the unifying force. The other thing, which I know has gotten the Halo lore people all Twitter, is that obviously the Keepers were pretty, like, if you're a true believer, you're a true believer. And they mention here or a little bit later, there's a reference which I totally missed until the very end of this book. And I'm like, wait, no. With some of the humans in his group, which I was like, wait, what? But that he's basically shooing them all away because the Banished are not human friendly, and people were like, "Rah!" because at one point they had sort of said that the Banished were more magnanimous than that, and here they make it like Atriox is just a regular old Covenant era human hater.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, you did get that feel for it.
And I mean, I can see where people think it's just sort of retcon. I can also see where after he got his butt stomped by the Spirit of Fire, he's less down on humans in general. I think he's missing a chance because, as the Keepers later note, like having a human when you're trying to like get foreigner stuff is pretty dang useful. But I guess Atriox doesn't particularly need the humans in good shape for that. If he wanted to. I mean, I can see where people are upset. It's a quibble, I think. It doesn't really impact it much for me.
No, yeah, it's I don't know, it's something that you read and it kind of struck me as a little odd, but it wasn't horrible. I don't think it's anything like breaking or anything of that nature at all.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just interesting that they're going that route.
Yeah, and I think the bigger thing that people are talking about is that this is basically a conceit so they don't have to explain why you aren't fighting human enemies in the games, which was a thing. It was pretty painful how they avoided it in Halo 2, and I think even 343 is kind of gun shy about having human enemies, which is understandable. I also don't think you need, if that was the concern, you don't need to explain why there aren't humans that you're fighting. Just say they're like off on another part of the ring, whatever. Same way how we weren't fighting brutes sometimes, and then brutes were always there.
Right.
But yeah. So Chief and company, special team as they're called, Chief and the flight crew and everybody else with their drills, head across the Glasslands. They see the brutes are fighting each other, and they decide, well, we're not going to make it on foot, so we need to steal some wheels, or wings, whatever you would say, grav, whatever. and they're sort of wondering at this point. The special team asks, like, how do you know we're not being led into a trap? And they're questioning Halsey, and blue team defends her, but it's definitely, if you're on that team, the answer you want to hear from your question of like, wait, is it true that she was collaborating with the enemy is not, it's complicated.
Right.
Like, not exactly what you want to hear. And I like that blue team trusts Halsey, but they also know her well enough. And like, I mean, she wouldn't betray us, but she could also have her own goals, and she's just not telling us. Um, I like that dynamic, that they know she's not really going to screw them, but they could get shafted just by like what she's not telling them, etc.
Well, I mean, she still sees the Spartan 2s as her children. I think, um, for all of its faults, the end of Halo 5, when, excuse me, when John and Halsey meet for the first time, you could tell that it was something she was looking forward to, and it, that she had feelings there in a paternal way. But she's also,
I think there were people who kind of complained about that, but I think that's definitely an example where the took you long enough thing, like I can see where that'd be flippant, but luckily the facial capture technology has gotten so good that you can read what she's saying. Like, yeah, she's being flippant, but it's obviously an emotional time for her, finally being the chief after so long and thinking he was dead in Halo 4 and stuff,
right,
and falling through Spartan Ops.
And also, I think they also know that, they know that that there's a mission that has to be done. So, there's compartmentalization of information, and you don't always have to understand why you're being told to do something. It's just important that you do.
They're soldiers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they put them off, but they have this new plan. And so they go on to initiate this plan of like sneaking up on this former settler base where everyone's suspiciously left, and the Banished are just fighting over what's left. And they they discover that there are these tunnels underneath the glass. And they get, one of the things I appreciate about this book that I don't think a lot of the other books do is the Spartans blue team gets beaten the hell up.
Oh yeah.
And it actually even becomes a point later on where Chief notes that like most of these people haven't seen Spartans, and they've never seen them like actually damaged. They've sort of bought into like this mythical and invincible feeling, and here everyone gets roughed up. They kind of like get some super healing to gloss it over, because you still got to have a book with Spartans doing Spartan-y stuff. But they get wrecked, and they basically have to flee into these tunnels they find, because their plan wasn't going to work. We get a mention that we get the auto repair nanites coming up with Gen 3 armor that they're wearing. So this is the stuff that they're going to have in Infinite. They don't have thrusters, which is an interesting bit.
A little disappointing, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's just one of those things where it's like, it's Jurassic Park level, like, let's ignore continuity for the sake of a set piece, because the lack of thrusters really comes into the very end of this book. Maybe they still have them. It's just whatever reason. Maybe they were damaged and they never brought it up. You can come up with some explanations.
And let's see. Chief had a leg wound. Linda had an arm broken. Fred got his bell rung.
Yeah, and badly. So we get the running joke throughout this part of the book going on is like Fred's concussed humor.
Yeah.
So if you want more goofy Fred, if you had forgotten that Denning is the guy who had another person ride Fred like it was a slalom, they also bring you someone literally standing on Chief at later points, and goofy concussed Fred. So there's levity in here.
Yeah.
Just kind of comical situations.
Was Linda injured? I don't think she was. Not in this part.
I believe Linda. Honestly, here's where I say even now I get Linda and Kelly confused. Besides, one's the fast one and one's the
The sniper.
Sniper. Yeah, one of the, I believe Linda's the only one left, like mostly operable by the end of this, which is fine because she got like left basically dead at the end of Fall of Reach, so she deserves some time to not get terribly horribly injured.
Very true.
Yeah, and there's actually an interesting bit here in this action scene that I think was a purposeful callback to Fall of Reach, where basically Chief punches a banshee out of the way, which I really liked. His callback to like the time he punched a missile during the Mark V trial runs. But they end up in the tunnels and they come face to face with, surprise, the colonists. And really the two ones you have to know about are Sasha Baldassar and Erdi, who are basically the two main people. And they're sort of detonating the tunnels behind them as they run. So blue team and special team, or part of blue team and special team, are separated for a brief period. And yeah, Fred has this little concussion goofball stuff. The nice point here is that they pretty much assume that blue team, the Spartans, are there along with the UNSC to help them liberate this world. And one of the weird things, it's sort of a quibble that I had in my notes until the very end of the book, basically, like, why do the colonists know what's going on? And it turns out they do know about Cortana, but it never comes up for most of this book, which felt a little weird, but I guess they're like, basically, we're doing our own thing, whatever. Well, like, unless the UNSC is going to come and save our bacon, we don't really care.
Well, I think it was, honestly, I think it's the idea that Cortana doesn't have any use for Reach. Not at this point. And as long as they didn't, attract attention, trying to make it livable again, as long as they don't make any waves, okay, fine. Just, we're going to be here to do our stuff. We won't bother anybody, so don't bother us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of the way that they're approaching it.
And the through line, obviously, is like, they don't want to lose what they've come for. They're there because they believe in Reach. Like, one guy lays out a line about, like, basically, my family would never forgive me if I wasn't buried here because everyone else is. It's, once again, like, I don't think you got like briefest touches of that human thing in Reach, but I don't think it was really that effective. It was more annoying. Like, if I accidentally shot a civilian, I had a quick fail kind of thing. They did more of it, I think, in the ad campaigns, the Remember Reach stuff, than they did in the game proper. So it's nice to have it come up in this way. And they even mention...
I'm sorry, I think it also gives life to Reach as a planet as well, because there's people who are struggling to bring life back to it, and it adds, in a way, it kind of amplifies the humanity that you're starting to see Chief show. And I mean, you probably have it in your notes, but it's, this whole section is, Chief knows what his mission is, but and so does Blue Team, but all of them want to help.
And it's really like they end up figuring out how to do both.
Yes. Because they're
happy ending
there.
there.
They can do that.
Yeah, but it's definitely a running thing of like, well, at some point, like, we're gonna have to end in this early on. Chief doesn't like lead him on really. He like pulls Baldassar aside, and like, when it's not gonna like crush everyone else, and says, all right, like, like, we didn't come here for you. Like, I feel bad, but like, we got our mission. And there's gonna be haggling later. At this point, we do cut back to Castor, and it's the last time we'll see him for a while. But we get this great parley between him and the other leaders of the Brutes on, basically, and this is another great thing that they set up, this set piece of, they're on this basically extruded glass dome where if someone breaks it, they'd all fall to their deaths. And there's this like Mexican standoff kind of like feeling going on, and
it had a very Good, Bad, and the Ugly
Yeah.
last gunfight feel to it.
Wah, 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 wah. And this is where we get a really good sort of deepening relationship with Gagodai and Castor, because like there's the politics of how everything's going out, and like Castor's freaking out because Gagodai's like, don't take your weapon out there. It's like, but the whole point of this thing is that if I don't have my weapon, I can't break the thing, and it's not the mutually assured destruction. Like, but he goes along with it, and there's these back and forth where each side is trying to play the other, and like Gagodai and Castor have to like work together to pull this through. And it comes out like basically because he's like, all right, guys, we got to stop fighting because the humans are here, and they're like, no. And like sort of faced with this intransience, Castor and Gagodai come up with like, wait, like we can just have the rivals find the Spartans for us, because they're just gonna like get killed by the Spartans, and that's the way we can track them and find out where they're going, following the corpses, which is again like, he's a smart brute, he's not dumb. And I like that. It's a good plan, which, as it turns out, doesn't work, but it's not because Castor's an idiot.
Well, I also think that it showed like I think there was a respect there that had grown between Castor and Gagodai. Because it seems like he wanted Castor to succeed, and he knew what needed to happen, kind of like a long game kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. And I think you're definitely right. And it's hard not to draw parallels to the current political situation. But like Castor's like, you're a solid dude. You're going to hell. I'm really terrible about that. But like, we're still going to work together. But you're going to hell. And at the end, he's like, come on, man. I'm really pulling for you because I don't want you to go to hell. But, it's just being a heretic. But he's a good guy for being a heretic. And Castor's willing to work him out. But they hit on this plan. And meanwhile, the Spartans are getting patched up by Doc Samaji or whatever. But Samogi, I don't know. At the separate settler base, which I had to look up too, because man, there's a lot of umlauts and double accent marks on there. It's Gadulu.
It's all Hungarian to me.
Yeah. And yeah, this was where I noted, like, man, he's like really beating up the Spartans, because like, yeah, as you said, John gets a chunk of his leg taken out, and the doctor's like, wow, you only survived this because your bones are like super augmented. And Chief's like, what do you mean super augmented? He's like, okay, yeah, sure, can't talk about it, it's just a lucky shot, sure. And as far as I know, she doesn't show up again, but we get, once again, like humanizing the colonists, humanizing Reach. We get like mention of her sons, Laszlo and stuff, and that, hey, they're up in the mountains with a couple old people like training, because we lost our transport. There's no way off this rock, so at the end of the day, we're gonna have to fight. And Bolidare is basically the CIC of everything. We learn that she had a Reach connection, which is why she's there. Everyone's excited about the Spartans, even though they don't realize the truth yet. And
this is also where we're introduced to Ditzel, the
yes,
5-time Tantalus 10,000 winner.
Yeah, there's some nice beats here, I think, that Denning does at making things recognizably but also alien. Like earlier on, we got a mention of the Martian Olympics. Here we've got the Tantalus 10,000 dune buggy race.
And just as a kind of and opposing especially to Halo Reach, how everyone hated, the one thing is no one let Cat drive. You always wanted Ditzel to drive.
Yeah, I did actually mention somewhere in here, like, wow, this is like so much, this is redeeming after Cat. Like,
yeah,
you want the furious driver. And they get some good driving antics later on. Yeah, and earlier on when they're talking about the crew chief, I forget what the exact line is, but they give her, like, they say something like typical features for a blah blah blah, where it's not like an Asian or a Indo-European or something, but it's from this planet, which was a nice touch. Like, yeah, that would make sense. That, like, especially as they've established in Reach and stuff, like some planets are more mono-ethnic or descended from that, so they would have, just like now, people from
Right.
different planets would look similar. So that was a nice little bit of world building. And I guess it makes sense that they would have crazy dune buggy races because we're still using wheels in the 2500s. And I also like just that she shows up and
Oh yeah.
she expects everyone to know who she is and like
Mhm.
ask what she's doing there. Like, I bet you're asking what I'm doing in here, and she's like, what? But later on,
You're who again?
Chapov is like, oh my god, it's you, which is really nice. And meanwhile, to all this, basically like Blue Team and Linda are in sporadic communication because Linda is with the rest of the unaugmented people in the drills doing the boring stuff, and they're following this abandoned aqueduct. And here is the only time I can really recall like Linda getting straight up angry. And like you said, like this is tying back to them being on Reach. Like Linda just talks about like she's pissed. Like the Covenant did this to the planet, they're gonna do it again. Like she comes off as the most upset on the entire team, which was nice. And we don't often get stuff from her point of view, so having this chapter is nice. It was the same thing with I think we got some of the stuff with her and the kids in Oblivion. It's just a nice look into her because I feel like she's probably the least sketched out of Blue Team.
Well, I think Oblivion had a lot of excuse me, Linda or Kelly moments too.
Yeah, I think
probably
Kelly and Linda were definitely
yeah.
They were both, I think, underserved or underutilized in the books going forward, and I think Denning has done a good job of bringing them up because I think I said in one of those things like Linda shoots well and Kelly runs fast, and to me those were kind of always just meshed up. And even Fred was like he's the funny one, and that's where I think, as someone who is not particularly a Blue Team fan, I think Denning has done a good job to endear them to me and make them more realized characters.
Yeah.
So we get this, basically this is inconsequential entire thing, except it's a character moment of like they argue. Chapov's like, well, we should go this way past this waterfall and dig our way out, but then we got to run across it and it's a death trap, or do we keep on following this aqueduct even though it's taking us away from where we want to go? And Linda's like, I appreciate your input. We're going this way. They're going to keep following Chief. And so in short order, they're tied back together, but not before we have the meeting of Blue Team and the Reach Settlers leadership. And we get again like Chief's being a little too old and stubborn and crotchety. He's kind of annoyed that like they don't follow. He's like, well, technically I'm not sir, I'm a non-commissioned officer. And they're like, whatever, you're the freaking Master Chief. Like, what? We are not standing on ceremony here. Like, our rank insignia are linen. Like, come on, guys.
Well, I think the thing is, this is probably the first time Chiefs actually had to deal with like irregulars. I don't remember him ever having to deal with that, so it's kind of a unique situation.
Yeah, it's something they've done more with. Like we get him working with the insurrectionists in Collateral Damage, and we get a brief bit early on. The opening of Oblivion is basically him working with the irregulars, and they get trashed because he's like, well, they're fighting hard, they're gonna do great, but it's pointless, they're gonna die. And he gets pissed off that basically, like with the insurrectionists, they leave him. The UNSC leaves him to dry. Which I think you can argue ties into where he's so committed to making a stand. It's like, this is my home. These people are fighting for it. I'm like, I want to help them because we've let a lot of people die because it's not on the mission. And another little bit we get is like OCR on steroids because Chief just like looks at their map of Reach and scoops it all up into his Mjolnir computer.
They fitted the visor with a scanner feature.
Yeah, and they so the colonists are gearing up because they think the Banished are after them, and in reality, it's actually Linda. And Chief's like, "You guys, you go up against the Banished, you're gonna lose." And as I wrote down, arguments ensue because this is, this is an I think even Denning does a good job, but these are my least favorite parts of any Halo book because inevitably it's civilians versus military or military branch 1 versus military branch 2
Mm-hmm.
just arguing about strategy. Like, it mostly just falls flat for me. It's not my favorite stuff. It sometimes leads to good character moments. Mostly it's just like people arguing. I don't think it does a whole lot. But we do get
I mean, other than maybe setting up some of the background and trying to show the passion, that's probably what these sections are for most. Other than finding out that they actually have nukes.
yeah, that's important. We learn like part of the thing they bring up is like, hey, Reach is worth coming back to because there's still like a crazy amount of titanium and stuff here. Like that's how they're funding this basically. Like we can fix the world because there's stuff on the world we want. We learn Chief learns from them that the Keepers are involved with the Banished. And that's when he first is like, wait, maybe they aren't after what we're after because they've been trying to figure out like, wait, how would they know how to get at this because they need our super biometric gloves Halsey gave us. Like this doesn't make sense. And yeah, and so like you said, Baldassar wants to use a Havoc because in like it's kind of like post-Soviet world out there. The UNSC left a bunch of nukes lying around, and man, the civilians want to blow someone up. And at one point, they're like basically, well, we're going to use it if it's a suicide mission. We're just going to attack this place and get the Banished to come into it and blow them up when they arrive. Which, as Cortana might say, it's not a very original plan, but we know it'll work because that's kind of what the UNSC has done in many a book.
Yes.
But
other than the fact that it would be a big arrow to Cortana saying, "Hey, something's going on right here."
Yeah, and that comes up, and so partially because like they don't want them to all kill themselves, and nuking yourselves is gonna do it. At one point, Chief says, you're gonna give everyone 3rd-degree burns like within 40 kilometers of this thing. It's gonna kill you. And then what are you gonna do? They can just blast you from the air anyhow. It's suicide. And so partially because they want to help them, and partially because they need their assistance at this point anyhow, they decide, let's not use nukes. We'll help you out. And so the plan is that they're gonna like basically dig under the armory this place has to capture it, and the Infinity, which has been basically like being incognito, and we'll catch up with Lasky and company later on. They're going to help with it. So there's a timetable they have to hit where they're going to drop off reinforcements. And here we get mine gas, which is surprising, but also like, hey, this is geology. You're going to hit a packet of bad air. Especially because basically they have a bog under all this glass stuff where everything just rotted and turned into a bunch of methane and CO2. And so they basically have to literally punch their way out. And they can't just dig into the sewers like they were gonna. They just have to go out. They kill some jackals. And they're forced to basically tunnel directly into the Banished base. We get more zonked out soldier humor, I mentioned again, because everyone's like hypoxic at this point, and they're like, hey, wait, I'm a person. I should be fighting. It's like, no, don't do that. So they pop into New Mohawk. Maybe that's how you pronounce it. On the ruins of Old Mohawk. And we get the attack of the Spartans doing their Splinter Cell thing. I mentioned like, all right, maybe this is just 2500 UNSC technology that suppressors are super quiet, but it's just one of those things where movies and TV always treat suppressors on guns like they're just this little whisper.
Yeah.
Or a cough.
That's not how they really are.
Anyone who has fired a gun in real life and then fired a suppressor with that gun knows, not really. But I still think this is a cool action sequence just because it's not something we've gotten. Usually it's big dang heroics where they're blowing up like 3,000 grunts with mines. This is Chief getting his Splinter Cell on, his Assassin's Creed, and they're like lobbing dead grunts on rooftops so there aren't bodies left behind. Basically like an race against time to get as much stuff done before they're discovered.
Just as a quick side note, that's the kind of thing I'd actually love to see in Infinite, where you have to be sneaky.
Stealth sections. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's definitely stealth has been a part of Halo, but it's always been a very underbaked mechanic. And I think
Mm-hmm.
I don't want it to be like, oh, the guard is aware, like the red cone is coming at it, but it would be cool if they're just like Halo 5 added some really cool stuff where
Mm-hmm.
you could had branching mission paths where like, well, you can help the colonists and get through this section, or you cannot help them, and Sloan will yell at you and stuff, and
Right.
it ties in. It would be cool to have like, what happens if I stealth through this section if no one
Mm-hmm.
notices me? That I would definitely like that too. And so they eventually get discovered, but they've been like chucking C10 cubes, which is that's like the most science fiction thing. It's like always like, what do we have C4? Like just add a bunch of numbers to it. That's how you know it's a future explosive.
Yes.
C10s, C10
Acts the
cubes.
same way. So, but then again, if it works, why change it?
It's just more so.
Yes.
And then the militia ends up starting an assault when everything comes out, and we got this big battle scene where they're trying to take out all the enemy armor. The Chapov has basically dug these lines of trenches to basically the Banished bash themselves against it, and cause severe casualties. And Chapov gets a compliment for his work and his initiative. Chiefs like that'll do, pig.
Well, I
he's
think
very happy.
That's actually one of the interesting things about the book is the maturation of Chapov. You know, he goes from this hotshot that Chief doesn't seem to have a lot of use for to
he's
a valued member of the team.
He's kind of annoyed by him, and he's more concerned with how he might. Yeah, you're right though. That he definitely has a character arc where he basically, as we'll get to, basically like ages 30 years in like 2 days and has his grizzled ancient ending that we expected would go to Van Hoot or Van Hout.
The hero moment, yeah.
Yeah, he gets his hero moment. And then we zip up to Halsey on the Infinity. And this was, I think, because we've, especially in like the aforementioned Hope for Halsey piece we talked about, it's like, what do you do if you're Halsey? Like, you have regrets? Like, do you got regrets? She has a lot. But I like, it's a very Halsey way of talking about it that, yeah, she apparently is practices lucid dreaming to deal with the nightmares she has. That's the only way she can get a good night's sleep, which like that tells you a lot about Halsey, like how much guilt she feels, and also of course she takes the scientist like approach to dealing with it. And that I like that you get the sense that she probably would, knowing what she knows now, she wouldn't have gone along with the Spartan program, but at the same time with Cortana's ascendancy, no, she has no regrets about Cortana at all. She's like, Cortana saved the universe.
Yeah.
This is just okay. Like, whatever. Like, you can get mad at me, but she saved the universe, which is an interesting, which is totally in character for her. And,
oh, yeah.
Like, she's right. She's being a dick about it, but she's right.
Well, I mean, I've said this to a lot of people. I don't consider Halsey a good person at all.
Oh, yeah, she's terrible.
But do I think she's the worst person in the Halo universe? No. That I won't go into that one. Sorry.
Yeah, well, and I think,
but I think that it is definitely in character for her. But yeah, I like you. I think that if knowing that if she knew then what she knew now, she probably would not have gone along with the Spartan 2 program because she had reservations then too.
And I think while Nyland generally does not emphasize how terrible and fascist the UNSC is, I think even in Fall of Reach, he did a good job with characterizing Halsey as, and then especially in Halsey's journal, she's the young hotshot who gets attention from the UNSC. She's flattered. She's brilliant. She thinks she's amazing. And she decides, well, if I don't do this, they're just going to get someone else. And obviously I'm the best person for it, so I should be the one doing it.
Well, yeah. And I also think that the UNSC kind of tricked her into doing it too. You know,
well, and once at some point, and at some point, like once she's into it, is she really going to get out?
Right.
And then how that matures to where she is in First Strike, where she's like, I'm tired of sacrificing people, and she's ready to wash her hands of it, to where she is now. I think it's a great it's a great arc to her, and you see where she is, and to the point where in Halo 5 she's pointing out like Cortana's doing this because she's like I did, like when at that time I thought and the greater good beats everything else, so do what you have to, and now I don't agree with it the same way. um it's a nice touch to see, and I like that we get a little more shading with that, how she reacts to Cortana's new role in the galaxy.
I think that this section, I mean, I've always thought Halsey was probably, no, not probably, Halsey is the best character I've come across in gaming. Period. End of story. Any game, any NPC, I have yet to come across one that is in depth or as complex as Halsey, and this section just further cements it to me. So
I think that would be hard for me just because so much comes from the supplemental stuff. But I would definitely, she's definitely an amazing character. I think definitely one of the top in, right up there with Cortana and Chief as the best characters in Halo, and ones that make it what it is versus any other sci-fi franchise. But Halsey is Halsey, so she's gonna confront Palmer and Lasky, who are worried about, like we said, that anything that will set off Cortana is bad, and we're just gonna have to bug out and leave them if it comes to it, because it's not worth losing Infinity. There's a more bickering commences. The aforementioned bickering that comes up to this stuff. But we get some good character stuff out of this, like Halsey being a dick, but once again kind of justified because she's making fun of the fact that Palmer tried to kill her. Palmer, meanwhile, is like, well, I don't really trust Chief just because he went AWOL once before, and she's definitely a by the book Spartan. But she's still gonna drop because she might be by the book, but she never is gonna put other people in harm's way when she can jump into.
Right.
So she's gonna drop down with a bunch of ODSTs and Spartans. Reach's moons get named, which I did not write down, and I do not know if this had actually come up before, but it was new to me. There are 2 moons that you see in all the skyboxes. They get names, which is nice.
Yeah, I don't remember them getting names before either, so...
And then we cut back to the planet where Blue Team is awaiting the inevitable counterattack from the Banished. They do some sneaky tactics in the rear before falling back. And here we have bits about, like, I mean, it's October 12th now, so it's been a day or two. And he's healed up more than any human, but he's running slower. He's got to make sure he doesn't aggravate his injury more, because then he's slowing down his team, and that could be disastrous. And we get, like we were talking about this, he has a moment where he's thinking about Chapov and like the young buck, and he's thinking about his legacy, which I liked. Chapov and Dizdol meet, and they're like, hey, wow, you're so cool. There's that flicker of like, hey, we should get a drink sometime. Which of course dooms one of them by the laws of story almost immediately.
Yeah, pretty much. The one thing I really loved with Ditzel and her parts is, here's someone who's just a normal human who is an excellent driver, but still is able to stun and in some ways scare Spartans just with her driving. You know, it's like, I just found it very humorous to me. She wasn't mentioned a lot, but
yeah. And it was not mentioned, but I just put an Australian accent on her in my head. They're like, you want to drive, and it's gonna do some Mad Max stuff. But the Banished air support arrives to drop straight into the city. And I like here that the second command, Erdai, basically like freezes up. He's like, all right, well, the UNSC was supposed to drop guys. We're doomed. He's getting new Cappy. So Chief like has some random subordinate like, hey, you got to get this stuff done or it's not going to get done. And then Blue Team like, all right, we're going to deploy the Havoc if it comes to it. You guys get the hell out of here. And the Banished take out the AA guns. The bombers are in position. They destroy a bunch of them, but there's going to be the second wave. And here's where I mentioned like that Dizdol serves as Chief's Warhawk driver, and man, he does a lot better than Cat. Another interesting thing I noticed was that I think this is, again, like if we've gotten it before, I've never heard it mentioned. The bombers deploy countermeasures. They're shooting out chaff or space chaff, whatever, to try and fool the guns, which doesn't work, but it was an interesting touch. And in general, there's definitely a streak of like Top Gun modern fighter combat in this entire book, because we get a
Oh
lot
yeah.
of, we don't get much atmospheric stuff in Halo generally. That's not just, game banshees
Yeah.
versus ospreys or whatever. Um, so that was an interesting touch, and it definitely, I can see where it might feel a little too present, but at the same time, it makes it more grounded and more technical and stuff like that.
I think also it was a nice little change. It was something new to add that we haven't really seen other than in Halo Reach, which is actually the last time we've seen that kind of space combat. Uh, so
So then we get this kind of goofy scene where they're like, all right, we're going to nuke the thing and we're going to jump onto a Phantom. So they have Distal jump into a Phantom's hangar. And then almost immediately they get news that, hey, the UNSC has launched missiles at your position. So they have to jump out of the Phantom. Which is like, oh, that's not fun. And Distal gets him out, but then she dies.
yeah.
And I did have in my notes, finally, because at this point it had been remarkably bloodless. I'm like, all right, somebody has to die here.
Mm-hmm.
Come on. But yeah, she just gets out. But we get a nice moment where, like, later on, like, Palmer is like, who was that? Like, someone who died. Like, yeah, probably died a heroic death, but it is what it is. You got to move on and remember him.
I do kind of wish there would have been a little bit more of a moment with in the flood with Mubotu.
Yeah, Mubotu, the sergeant
Yeah.
who nearly gets through the library as a human being.
Yeah.
And he's like, you were one hell of a son of a bitch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I like that. And I think they have points here where, like, Chief's like, I mean, they're going to lose, but you got to admire the colonists fighting
Right.
like they do. They definitely, Denning, he has the UNSC are pretty damn competent, but he doesn't let them outshine the other humans, I think. And we also get in another, like, blue team is angry. Kelly just triple taps some skirmishers they've already killed for the hell of it. She just drives back and forth over them. Like, on one hand, like, you think the Spartans would have a little more discipline than that. On the other hand, you're like, yeah, I get that feeling.
Yeah, I think it's like I said, it's putting a little bit more of a human face to them. Maybe it might be a little extreme,
But yeah, are they the
mean,
machine or are they human?
Yeah, that kind of thing. But
yeah, and the Spartan fours finally arrive. Here comes the cavalry. Chief Breeze Palmer. They talk about stuff, and you get the sense, like, yeah, Palmer's not really sure she can totally trust Chief, but she knows he's a soldier, get the job done, etc.
mm-hmm.
There's still a lot of mutual respect. We get mentions of new fire teams, which I had to look up and see, like, did we know these people before? But it's Fire Team Taurus and Intrepid, and the only thing I know is that Fire Team Taurus has a Mega Block set. So they exist in toy form.
Yeah. I will admit I was kind of disappointed we didn't see Crimson and Majestic, or what was left of Majestic. Say, but
yeah, that was and actually that felt like a missed opportunity. And the only other thing that I felt like a missed opportunity returning to Reach was that they mentioned specifically that Chief had been to Reach a couple times before, which felt a little kind of weird, but also I wish they had mentioned specifically the fact that they came back for the frame tale around the Fall of Reach
right.
animated series, because they have them sort of coming back to remember the fallen Spartans in that around the Halo 5 time, post Halo 4. So it would have been nice to have that mentioned, but I get you can't have every single mention in here. But so they don't have to steal. After all this time of trying to steal a Covenant vehicle, they get a Pelican. So they don't have to do that. They get a castle base. And they get patched up a little. John is wary because he knows the Keepers are around. And they see a Banished Corvette heading to the mountains, and that's Asharum. So after what has been a very long chunk of this book, we finally go back to Castor. And here, the big news here is that we learn basically Castor's been going through everything he's been going through basically on the will of the Oracle, who, once again, I don't know if it's entirely said in this book, but it's Intrepid Eye from Halo Last Light and following through. So that's another. There's this Machiavellian Forerunner AI out there just subtly tweaking things behind the scenes, and she's still apparently in play. And doesn't get totally resolved, but as we're going to find out, basically, she's manipulating the keepers, and so it'll be interesting to see if that pays off, where that pays off.
Yeah, because I'll admit, I had kind of forgotten about Intrepid Eye, but I remember that one of the things she had really wanted to do is test the humans.
Mm.
And it's just this, it makes me wonder, how much of this whole thing is Intrepid Eye behind the scenes. So
yeah,
it's in the greater, in the not just here, but in the greater occurrences in the Halo universe right now.
Well, to me, the thing with Intrepid Eye is she's basically the assembly except done better. I think the assembly was a terrible idea, and I'm glad it's never really going to be addressed. They didn't, like, 343 basically like put something out like, yeah, this weird stuff we found on Reach. Who knows if it's true or not? Because there's interesting stuff in there. For instance, that's where you get the idea basically that, like, the grave mind could be his intelligence could be housed in slip space, and that explains how it's basically permanent and continuous even after you kill a grave mind. And that could be the way that AIs live forever. There's interesting stuff in there, but
yeah,
and it ties into Halsey's journal. But to me, the whole AI's engineered human covenant contact is just bad. But here, I think it works better because, yeah, it's one foreigner AI who's messing around behind the scenes, and she's got her own objectives, but it ties in much more directly to what's going on.
Yeah,
that's how I feel. The other interesting thing here we get from Gagodai is that the Singhili live a lot longer than brutes, and I guess it's not clear whether it's just because brutes kind of they live hard and kill each other off with frightening regularity, but he mentions that, like, 80 or 90 is really old to a brute. He's surprised to hear how old Gagodai is. But so Asharum and Castor meet, and Asharum's kind of pissed. They're like, hey, we gave you this. You said you had this great plan, and it hasn't led us to capturing these enemies. What the hell? And this is where you see how that relationship has changed between Castor and Gagodai, because Gagodai actually goes to bat for Castor, and he's surprised. And they figure out, though, once they see where the Chief's Pelican's going, they're like, all right, well, we know the location of the portal now.
Right.
So we don't have to keep him alive. We can go kill him. Cool. And, like, that, basically the next chapter, the blue team realizes, hey, they actually might be trying to kill us now.
Oh, yeah.
And so, like I said, this is where we get an aerial dogfight, which is not really common in Halo. Between all the broadswords, there's lots of explanations of, like, well, the broadswords only have this much fuel, so they can only support you for this long. I guess the something else I saw from people talking about how this ties into Infinite is overall they are not without casualties, but the UNSC pretty much wipes the floor with the Banished in this.
Well, in a way, that makes sense, though, because you have to remember, the Banished, all their stuff is like hodgepodge thrown together. It's
and
kind of
and
held together.
Presumably Atriox might have taken the best stuff with him, etc.
Correct. So, and the Infinity, still houses top of the line stuff at the time. So,
and they're carrying 4 frigates on them, basically, and part of the only reason they don't get blown out of the sky is because they're afraid. Infinity's afraid that might alert Cortana earlier. So we get some canyoneering to evade the enemies. The Pelican does some this is podcasting whippy stuff, and then they crash into Highlands, the multiplayer map, one of at least 2 clear references to the multiplayer maps, which I like, because obviously multiplayer maps, they're multiplayer maps, but it's nice when they've got a fiction to tie them in, or to as in one case invent more of an explanation for them. And yeah, obviously this comes into the character because this is where the Spartans were trained. They literally find the training bell from the Fall of Reach from like their first
And
exercise.
yeah, that part is, I don't know, when I read that and I'm like, that was the part that I had like stopped and reread like 2 or 3 times the first time through. I'm like, they found the bell. I mean, for whatever reason, that was just so cool. And so
Yeah, that's the thing. It felt like there was a fan service pass under this book, and then when they finished the fan service pass, they did another one. And there's almost too much fan servicey things in this for Reach related stuff. It feels like they went overboard. I know it's like little nods here and there, but there's too many little nods. Maybe is that a bad thing to complain about?
Nah. Well, I mean,
uh,
that's the question of how much fan service is too much.
yeah.
It's always a question. Um, I
Well, the
think
other
I appreciated that it came up just because we actually got a mention of Sam, which is like justified. Like, hey, remember that guy who was Master Chief's best friend who died early on? Denning has not forgotten about him, and it was nice to have him brought up.
It's yeah.
I think the other thing is though that I mean, 343's kind of been playing pretty heavy on the nostalgia, at least with what we've seen from Infinite.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I personally liked it, but then again, like I said, Fall of Reach is my favorite novel, so I like the callbacks, but I can totally understand when you're saying that there's a lot there,
Yeah.
and for it it kind of teeters a little bit on maybe being too much.
Yeah.
But
I mean, if
yeah,
if it was not clear that this was going to have a lot of Fall of Reach fan service, the cover is a literal updated recreation of the Fall of Reach cover. So maybe we should have all known that was coming.
yeah.
Yeah. But so they head out to Castle Base, but Chapov does not make it. He gets his grizzled ancient Johnson slash I'm gonna make it count. Leave me with a rocket launcher, because he's been like impaled by shrapnel or whatever happens to you, and he gets to like scratch 2 or 3 banshees off screen. So he gets to go out with a bang. So he gets to like I said, he gets his like 30-year soldier arc here from like Callow Ute to I was 2 days from retirement thing. But they reach Castle Base or the pit that leads up to it. Which again, like they talk about like yeah they leveled it and then no one like cleaned it up, so it's just like filled up with shale and crud. But the keepers are clearing it with a I like this. They basically are using grav lifts to kick stuff out, which felt to me like a very Halo Forge thing. It's like not something we normally see, and like even the Chiefs like, well, that's a new use of grav lifts. But it was so that was nice. But of course, there's like thousands of troops and a Corvette in their way. So the broadswords have to launch an attack. The blue team uses target designators to clear out the armor. They're followed by longswords, which I was happy to see because longswords are better than broadswords. Like broadswords are just normal fighter jets. Longswords look futuristic and cool. Like they say, like, well, they're not really atmospheric fighters, but they're cooler. All right.
Yes.
More longswords, please. And another in the like possible Halo Infinite stuff is we get like some sort of new red colored plasma launcher thing, which they do not describe the actual name of, but I assume it might come up.
There was definitely a few Halo Infinite drops in this book as you're going through. It's like, oh, the grapple hook. Oh yeah, nice. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, and I think on the plus side, if we're talking about like fan service or like stuff that has to get checked off, the Halo Infinite stuff definitely feels less intrusive than it did in like say Karen Travis, because it's mostly just like weapons and stuff coming up in the Banished instead of like, all right, well, we need to hit these next 3 plot points for Halo 4, so you need to figure out some way of fitting them in.
I didn't like at the start whenever the folks are trying to identify which enemy groups are about, and it's like, well, what's Banished, and I don't know, it felt unearned at the start of the book, the sort of reputational thing with the Banished, and the sort of pacing
Yeah,
with it.
it's always going to be like, I mean, I think they did as good a job as they could have, like retconning the Banished in, but you're right, there's always going to be this little weird, like, I would appreciate even if, like, Chief was been like, well, I've never dealt with them, but, like, Blue Team has had some, like, something, just, like, because, yeah, we know, like, we're following Chief around most of the time, so that's like the best explanation you can give. Like, well, he never fought him, so it's just one of those things. You have to like, all right, they had to introduce an enemy, like just fit him in there. Just you gotta move past it.
And it was a good opportunity that they had to show the scale of the war efforts. You know what I mean? Even in passing, they could have made mention of the fact that the chief is just one dude in a literal galaxy full of hell going on. But nah, nothing.
Yeah, I mean it's tough because it is a Master Chief story. So it's they've widened 343 has widened the concept, the scope a lot, but fans want Master Chief, and by God, they're doubling down on it.
Yeah. Well, that and the other thing is, I think they really want to try to keep from making the book required reading.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, and that can be a tall order, as we saw in Halo 4 to an extent.
And that's I think the reason they went all Maltese Falcon with Halsey's flash clones and never explained it, because like then you have to explain like what, like you just like all you need to know is Halsey's into some bad juju, and like that's why we're here. It's supposed to win us the war, and like just move on. Like we're not going to try and get into all this.
But the thing is, I that's one of the issues I had with the story in general. Actually, is the fact that it's another Cortana MacGuffin. It's, you know what I mean? Whenever you're thrust into a story, it's like, no, they have to get this very important thing to save the everything. It's like, for fuck's sake, come on. I've just started this book.
To be fair, this is the evolution of the classic, the like Halo story, because instead of getting the Forerunner MacGuffin that we end up having to destroy because the Covenant will get it, instead we've got the human MacGuffin.
I'm sick of MacGuffin chases, damn it. Halo Readers and idea people, stop MacGuffinizing things.
It's just part of storytelling, Danny. Rage against the dying of the light. All right, so Chief heads into the shaft, and at this point, like finally, Blue Team realizes, wait, they're not after Castle Base at all, because they've dug a hole past Castle Base down to the Forerunner thing, and of course they're like, well, that's not good, because Forerunner stuff, like, who knows about that? So this is the reason why Gen 3 doesn't have thrusters, as we discussed, because like otherwise you can have this weird thing where like they basically have to like play around rappelling down, and then Chief loses his line and he has to like float around in the grav lift. He plays a game with chicken with the brute at the Castle Base entrance, which is delightful. And then, as John is wont to do, he falls from a great height and gets his armor locked up, and the Blue Team basically has to come and save him. This actually is a nice little scene, because usually we don't have the Jackal at the Kig Yard doing much, let alone talking to humans. But we get a Jackal who thinks he's a total badass walking up to Chief and trying to interrogate him. And he, of course, dies for his trouble. But it's a nice
more moments like that, please. More moments like that.
Yeah, he's like, this is great. I'm gonna like figure out what you're after here, and he basically kills him really quickly after that. But so yeah, that whole sequence leaves Blue Team in even rougher shape. But they're like, well, whatever the Banished are after, we've got our mission. So they enter Castle Base proper. And the UNSC, we learn, has won the day on the surface. They're sending Fred and company down to see maybe we can figure out what the Banished are after while Blue Team's doing their thing. And then we get the random spookiness, because they enter Halsey's lab, and then they spot something. Kelly has the spoofer gloves, because we figured out that they had these special biometric stuff to spoof Halsey, because otherwise there's a failsafe and it'll blow everything up. So they have to use this. And we get a last little bit of Kalmaya from The Fall of Reach, who was basically Cortana's older sister. And who I was about to get upset because, like, oh, man, how did she survive this? But as it's just basically an echo, like a subroutine that she left behind. Not really a smart AI who was left as a failsafe for Halsey's lab. But she gets, like, a little bit of existential angst about, like, well, what am I? Like, what am I doing? Like, why would you kill me? That doesn't seem fair. And then they just shut her down with Halsey's old code of whatever it takes, which I feel like it's a bad override code, because someone's going to say that like comes up in natural. It's not giraffe battery staple. Like, that's a bad trigger phrase. Someone could say that.
I don't know. it seems suitable for somebody who likes to test on children. Like, it's, yeah, whatever it takes.
Yeah, I mean, but people are gonna, like, you're working in Oni, whatever it takes is gonna come up in phrases a lot. Just saying, like,
Especially
you should have
with
rethought
Oni.
that. Yeah. But yeah, we get that little ghost Kalmaya, which is once again, like, is that too much fan service? It's weird, but it's over quickly. And they basically have to they get the intel, but they have to, like, climb out of this ruined lab where it's like, well, either we're both getting out of here because there's, like, this piece of debris they have to get past by, like, cantilevering it, or no one's getting out. And meanwhile, Fred is spying on the keepers, and a wild Veda Lopez appears. And this is where I was like, oh right, they mentioned the humans where they described one as mom, and it was like, oh, of course it's Ferret Team. I totally missed that. So that was, for me, that was a great reveal. A Denningverse deep cut come back, and Lopez gives him a message and then fires at him to maintain his cover. So they don't really get a moment, but they get a message, as we find out later. And Castor, meanwhile, is in what is clearly the Hang 'em High / High Noon multiplayer map, which is a great little touch, because in the remake of Hang 'em High, they have this giant portal in the background, and that turns out to be what they've been after this entire time, the slip space portal that they will use to bring Atriox back from the Ark.
To be fair, it was really fucking smart. That shit took planning to put that in there in that way, and I really appreciate that. It shows you that people really do care about background details with stuff, you know? So really, really awesome.
Yeah, it was nice. So they activate the portal, and then the Banished arrive. So we got a bunch of names, so like Zeradus, Jaro, Ratum, Balkaris, maybe those guys. Like that, to me, I put in the notes, like, hey, maybe these guys are going to be like the open world bosses that we're going to kill at some point.
Yeah. Very Destiny too, that isn't that? You to kill the bosses before you finish the story kind of thing. It's like, okay.
Yeah, it definitely had some Zeradus or Destiny 2 bosses. And then Atriox has entered the chat, and he's kind of being a dick because he's basically going to leave the Banished on the Ark to their own devices. And considering we killed off like all his, well, I guess there's a.
Well, we sawed his one CAS carrier in half with it.
Yeah, but I guess let the former owner of that carrier is still there, so maybe he's the one in charge. But we killed off a lot of his other lieutenants, so. But he's clearly, obviously, you know, whatever is it's important if he's leaving the Ark to come get stuff. He gets a greater purpose line, so we're left wondering what exactly that'll be. And then this is the nice twist, because Castor's dead set on going to the Ark because, once again, he's a religious zealot. And he basically gets Gagudai to join him because Gagudai, like, he can't. Atriox is like, all right, we'll kill him. And like, well, there's no way you're stopping us from not getting on that lich and heading to the Ark. And Gagudai's like, well, that's a suicide mission, but it's either I join you or I get killed, because I'm gonna not kill you to satisfy Atriox. So the erstwhile new best friends and Ferret Team and everybody else jump on into the Ark, where Atriox is like, you guys are going to get killed because they're still banished there. But obviously the Spirit of Fire is there, so maybe the Spirit of Fire and Ferret Team meet up in Halo Wars 3 or something. It's a possibility.
Veda Lopez is one of the new leaders for the Spirit of Fire.
Yeah, that would be super cool. I like her. I like the relationship with her and Fred. And I like that this could be the end of Castor and the Keepers of the One Freedom, and I feel like it's a good enough end, because he's like, well, yeah, if we die, like, okay, that's just the beginning of the great journey. He's happy as a clam, basically. That he's
it's a better end than a certain someone got a certain video game opening. Certain someone, hint, hint.
Yes.
Remember Jewel. R.I.P.
They didn't.
No, they remembered him. They just dealt with him really quickly. So maybe Castor dies in the first. Well, all right. So who do you think got done dirtier, Jewel or God, what's his name? Telcam, who just got killed in a wordless.
Yeah.
No, not a wordless comic. a comic that was assigned wordless except for wort. I think it's like the only word in there, one or two words or something.
I'd probably still say Joel, actually, because he got built up so much.
Yeah,
And
I
it's
think
just
it
like,
was
really?
how they positioned him in the expanded stuff and led people who followed that to have certain expectations, which were never ever going to be followed up with. So yeah,
I mean, I get like he lived as he died in cutscenes, but or died as he lived. But it definitely, I think my issue with that was not that he was killed, but that he just died in a cutscene to show off how cool. Whereas, like,
Yeah.
if you have us do it, it's more satisfying, and you still show that Osiris is cool and kills people.
Yeah. Could we
The
maybe
fact
have
that
had one less warden fight and had him as a boss? Maybe.
oh, we need more
Possibly.
warden fights. I don't know what you're talking about.
No.
more Warden Fights 2020, the
Yep.
platform everyone get behind.
I had to remember. It took me an hour to remember how to bypass the last warden fight with the three of them when I was doing
with the
my run
ground
through
pound.
Halo 4. It's like, oh.
Yeah. Yeah, if they had killed him off in gameplay, that'd have been better. Especially since he kind of goes out like a chump. Like, there's not really it doesn't seem like they break a sweat, and that doesn't feel as cool so much as just disappointing. Like, come on, we saw all those cool flips and shit you did in the first one. Why couldn't you have it harder? Here, it was kind of lame. We aren't here to litigate the past again. We're here to talk about the future. And basically, Gagadai and Castor and the Keepers all get their wish because everyone realizes, hey, when you activate a giant foreigner installation, that's going to draw Cortana to you. So let's get the hell out. And the UNSC prepares to bug out, but ultimately, a few people do get marooned because they aren't able to exfiltrate before Halsey or Lasky's like, we gotta get out of here before they see the neutrino emissions or whatever of the Guardian arriving in the system, and they have to get out of there. So there's some unfortunate guys who get marooned, but I guess they can hook up with the settlers and rebuild Reach.
That still had some hope in there because of that. And I think that was, I mean, for me, it was like, okay, it's an understandable thing. It's like you can't get everybody out because there was just too many people to try to get out.
Well, it's less dire than what's her name, Helena or whoever on Meridian. That basically is left like as everyone leaves the planet and gets nuked, and then she has a short story where it doesn't really. She survives, but it's still up in the air about what happens to her. So, I think the idea is they're going to be marooned for possibly years, but they're going to be okay. And Veronica Dare shows up for. You thought we were going to get through this entire book without an Oni spook, but here she shows up at the last minute. And she gets the intel from the Ferret team, and we learn that Fred got a special message from Lopez. We don't know what it is, but he gets to keep that little bit. Dare doesn't need it. It was nice. And Halsey arrives, and here we get another little character moment because she has never apparently seen. Well, which I was like, well, but she did like resurrect Linda from the dead, but otherwise she's still very much affected by the fact that Blue Team's beaten up to hell. And that's it, which felt like a kind of quick end, but I mean, you gotta.
So it's like, yeah, and now what? And then what happened?
We're gonna find out. The MacGuffin wasn't the point, so it just ends.
And hopefully the next novel. So
yeah, so and that definitely leaves the question of, is Cortana's sister clones, whatever, going to come into Halo Infinite? Is that going to be maybe what relates to the AI capture thing we've seen in the Deliver Hope trailer, etc.? It does leave the question of, is Asharum, it doesn't seem likely, I think, given what happens here, that Atriox is going to be dead by the time we get to Infinite, that maybe he's off doing something, or maybe he's just like the shadowy big bad that we're going to deal with Asharum half the time and then Atriox shows up. But I don't feel like they're going to kill him unless it's like he dies in the climactic opening battle and we find that out later on. I don't think he's done with. Which
I really hope they don't kill Atriox. He's too good of a of an adversary.
Yeah, and I think the my main complaint with Halo Wars, as I talked about in the review of it, which you can find on YouTube or on forwarduntodon.com, shameless plug, was that there was sadly not as much as Atriox was a compelling villain. There just wasn't. We got more out of the know your enemy like joke commercials for the game than we did interplay with him and Cutter in the game, and I want Atriox to get that time. I think what they're doing with the Sharm is like he's looking for this, like fighting the Master Chief as this one final rocky battle to greatness is a cool dynamic, but I want to see Atriox have that with some people too. So I hope, yeah, he doesn't go away.
The one thing Halo has suffered from for a long time now is a big threat. They keep moving the goalposts about the state of the impending threat to the galaxy, as it were. So I'm not really sure. I'm not convinced because you know what I mean. It's like it's another big bad guy potentially. Oh no, God, is this going to be like another guild moment for us, or I don't know whether or not to care. You know what I mean?
That's where I'm hopeful that this book is something of a template for where they're going, because I know there's the people who don't like the created story arc period are like, well, I hope Infinite wraps it up. And I feel like, to me, if they just wrap everything up in a neat bow after one game, depending on how it's done, obviously, that would feel pointless and inconsequential, like especially since we've had this skip of time where it's been. So I hope with them introducing the Banished.
Well, don't forget as well, like Infinite is supposed to be like a soft reboot, but you can't soft reboot without wrapping up all the other shit that you pulled everyone else through for the past couple of effective games. You know what I mean? So it's I'm not happy or excited right now with what they're doing. That's the thing. You know what I mean? Like they have this universe that they've been updating now since Halo 4. They've had full control over where it goes and the state of things. And is this it? Is this the ultimate setup for the Halo universe right now?
I don't know. I think it's solid in that I hope that they're following this template for Shadows of Reach, in that we get movement on the Cortana arc, but that they allow it to be this thing that is influencing everything else. But we don't necessarily deal with her directly. She's like this shadowy threat, Voldemort kind of thing. And we're having this more localized thing with the Banished, that we've got the battle here and it's feeding into the bigger thing. That's my hope. We'll see. Obviously, it's shocking to think that we could have been playing Halo right now and this would all be moot. But
well, yeah.
And instead we enter the winter of our discontent.
Yes. Well, I think one of the things is, I think, and this is something I said to friends of mine, it's like, what I want 343 to do is pick a path and go with it. And it seems like they have, at least they started that with 4. They reversed it in 5, and now they've kind of changed it again. I'm hoping that this is the path that they choose. Just run with it. If you want to, if you want to just have the created as this overarching that maybe gets touched on here and there, and that storyline slowly progresses, great, fine. I'd be fine with that. I think that some of the writers that they have done a pretty good job with that, and have us deal with the Banished as a more immediate thing. Like I said, I'm just I have to see it, but that's what I'm hoping I see.
It's weird. I think it's the anti-gamer stance of like how people think, but that one of their problems is that they've just been too reactive to feedback, instead of like, well, I'll take that advice and we'll see. Instead, they're like, well, these people said this, so we got to like reverse this. And I hope that, like, the same thing with like, because like after Halo 5, Frank O'Connor was talking about like, well, like, Cortana's not really evil, like, and we didn't make her just evil. And I would argue that it's that she's sort of like an inversion of Halsey, etc. Like that she's definitely evil in the sense of like what she's doing is terrible and she's ignoring the collateral costs and stuff. But if they just make her evil, then you've wasted that. And like that sort of like being, well, everyone thinks she's evil, so we just got to lean into that. Like that's concerning. Like everyone like the Banished, like make the Banished the big bad. I just hope that they integrate that and don't take the criticism too far, because at the end of the day, like a as we've seen with Star Wars, a creative vision that's followed through is better than trying to just go back and see what try and please what you think the fans want.
I don't know if that's a low blow or not.
I have faith. And we'll see what we get with the extra time, and we'll see. Yeah, I think overall I like this book. I think it does a good job of being its own thing, tying up, perhaps with too much fan service, but tying together a lot of old threads, finishing up old threads satisfactorily, and giving suggestions. I think it for serving as sort of like a first strike book, as we're setting up things with its own story, but we're also bridging the gap to try and set up the next game. I think it does its job well. And obviously, people like Denning. Especially, Denning noted that this reached the USA Today bestseller list, which, from what I've seen, is the first Halo book to crack a bestseller list since Silentium back in that day. So it's been a while, and I think that is indicative of people excited about Halo, which is great.
I was going to say that might be a bigger trend rather than a, you know what I mean, a bigger trend for
not
push
specifically
for the platform
the book
and all the rest of it going together, and the toys and stuff. It has an impact on people's interest in general.
Yeah, and but that's good, and I'm hopeful that the delay makes people happy. I mean, obviously it won't make people happy, but reasonable people being happy. I'm hopeful for it. And yeah. Anything else you want to say about the book before we close out?
I mean, I really enjoyed it. I think, like you said, it closed some questions out. There are still some that are there. I think there's still room for more stories in the Halo Wars lane of it. Maybe with the Keepers as a new adversary. I really enjoyed it. As a novel, like you said, there's a lot of callbacks and fan service, maybe a little too much, but overall, I enjoyed it. It was an enjoyable read, and for the lore nerd in me, there were a lot of things that's like, oh, that's okay, So
yeah, but hopefully, we're gonna have content out before Halo Infinite, but hopefully we'll hear more non-microtransaction stuff soon.
Well, to be fair, they're running out of Master Chief Collection stuff to milk. Like, they've got Halo 4 pretty much done at this point. They still have the Halo 5 PC port they surprise announce, and then they're done with excuses. They have to start doing new stuff, so hopefully get a flight out for Infinite or something they can done.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll be hopeful. We'll see. All right, so that wraps it up this week. I'd like to thank Pens for joining us.
Thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and show notes and links for this episode to stuff we talked about, as well as articles and more, can be found on our website, forwardtodawn.com. You can subscribe to the podcast by iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or Stitcher. You can check out our videos on YouTube at youtube.com/forwarduntodawn, or follow us on Twitter for updates to all our content by following the handle ForwardDawn, because some jerkhole took Forward Unto Dawn and has not tweeted in 4 years. We can't take it. Thanks, Twitter. So, thanks for listening, everyone, and see you next time.